Good morning, everybody. It's Dr. Karen, and today I am going to talk a little bit about language screenings. So, again, today talking about how SLPs can identify kids who might be in need of full language evaluations. So, I get asked the question all the time, what's the best screener to use? How do I know when I should go through with the full evaluation? And how I can find which kids might need my services and also do that in a way that is efficient because let's be honest, if you are an SLP, you don't have a ton of time and you need a good process to help you make good decisions to make sure that you're not either spending way more time than you need to screening, but then also that you're not under identifying kids that might need your help. So the main shift that you want to make when you're thinking about language screenings is number one, that a screening is not a test. It's not a physical rating scale or whatever, the way that we've been trained. We don't want to think about a screening as one specific test, but rather a process. Yes, that process might involve certain formal assessments that have certain criteria. And so that can be a tool that you use in order to complete that process of screening, but that is not the process itself. And we want to remember that when we are screening, all we're doing is identifying red flags. We're simply figuring out how to raise our hand and say, hey, there's something going on here that we need to look into further. And if we can say, yes, there is something that needs to be investigated further, we've done our job, we've answered that question. We're not trying to diagnose at this point. All we're trying to do is figure out when we might need to look into things further. The diagnosis, again, is what you're going to do when you're actually evaluating. So the thing is that a lot of times when you are doing a language screening, one of two things can happen. Number one, maybe the whole process takes way longer than it needs to and it's kind of overwhelming. And that's not a good thing because if you're an SLP, you have a huge caseload. But then on the other end, a lot of times there are different screeners that they're helpful, but if you're relying on one criterion score, then sometimes they miss things and a kid might, let's say that they are not in a good mood that day, they don't understand the directions and they fail the screening and really there isn't a problem. Or on the other end, they pass the screening because it is very structured and maybe it doesn't tap into all the different skills that are an issue for that student that are language related, but for some reason they're able to pull together and get enough points on that assessment that they pass, and then you've missed a student that might need your help. So when we think about the process of screening, we want to remember that number one, federal guidelines don't require you to have any specific score on a certain test in order to initiate a screening. We can actually, if a parent comes to us and makes a written request for us to evaluate, we can go ahead with an evaluation. You might have different procedures in place in your organization, but federal guidelines don't say that you have to have certain things in place. So you can simply use non-standardized procedures in order to go through the screening process to see if you have enough information to go ahead and say, there's a concern here, let's look into this. So one of the things that I have done in the past, and this is when I was in the schools, if a student would come to, or if a teacher, a parent, or anybody would come to me with a concern about a student, I pulled in a number of different resources to make that decision. And I had some questions that I would ask to figure out, all right, could this be a language issue and should I look into it for an evaluation? And yes, sometimes I would use things like, I used the Self 4 screening tool, and I believe the Self 5 has one as well. I used that for a supplement sometimes if I wanted to pull kids out and just do something with them. I had some different informal things that I would do where I would ask them to retell a story or an event so I could listen to their language, or I would ask them WH questions about a story or have them retell things that they listened to. I would do some informal things like that. But Also, what I would do is that I would just look at the data that was already there and look at the information that was already being presented. Because if someone is coming to you with a concern, chances are that they've already observed some things that are a concern to them. So those concerns alone can actually be enough for you to say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and evaluate. So what I would ask and what I would look for is that I would talk to teachers about performance on academic assessments that tapped into language. So this could even be things like, could they complete math word problems? How do they do on reading comprehension assessments in class, or written responses or writing samples? So I would get this information from the general education teacher, the special education teacher, reading specialists. Actually, the reading specialists were really came to me a lot with referrals for language, because a lot of times there might be kids who were getting reading interventions, and the reading specialist would sometimes come to me and say, hey, could this be a language issue? What can I be doing in here? Do we need to look at anything further? So they had a lot of information, and they did assessments that I could look at and say, hey, based on what you've already done, I think I have enough information that I know yes or no I need to evaluate. And also the psychologist would often be doing some screening. Sometimes they would do an assessment or a screener, and that would tap into language. And no, I wouldn't use that to diagnose, but I might use it to indicate, to help me indicate if that student needed to have a language evaluation. So I would pull that kind of information in. Now, the thing is that if you've never done this before, sometimes that process of figuring out what information you need to get from teachers, if you want to go and do observations yourself and observe that student, if you want to just go have some conversations with people who are working with that student, sometimes it's a little bit confusing to know what to ask for when you're having those conversations. So what I've created for SLPs, and this is actually something that comes from the materials of my Language Therapy Advanced course library, my materials library that I provide the members of that program. But I have a rating scale. I call it the Academic Language Skills Rating Scale. And what it is it's a non-standardized assessment that I just created based on the questions that I often ask teachers or anybody who's making a referral. So I use it in a couple ways. I use it for screenings to figure out, do I need to do an evaluation? And then I also use it to guide conversations for kids who are already on my caseload when I'm filling out progress reports. Now, what it is a non-standardized tool that gives me additional information when I either don't feel like a formal screening is giving me the information that I need, or maybe sometimes it could give me enough information that I don't need to do a formal screening. It's not meant to replace diagnostic assessments for a full language evaluation. It's simply meant to dive into some additional things. It's also meant to be a conversation starter. So it is an assessment tool that you can give teachers and help them, and they can fill it out for you. I actually have different scores that they can give for how the student is following directions and things like that based on their observations of the student behavior. And it does structure it a little bit, but again, it's meant as a conversation starter, not as this is the whole picture. So one way that you could do it is just have a teacher fill it out and just look at what they said, what responses they said, and what information they're giving you there. Or you could go in with the screener and just talk to the teacher and have a conversation and fill some of that information out as you're talking to the teacher and get qualitative information that way. And this can be something that you do with, doesn't just have to be a classroom teacher. You could talk to parents, you could talk to other professionals that are working with that kid. But it's meant to just help guide those conversations. And what I would sometimes do with it is that when I was sitting on the district problem solving team for kids who were already getting interventions, or teachers were concerned about their academics or behavior, sometimes I would have that on hand. And as I sat in on those meetings, I would ask different questions. And sometimes based on the conversation that was happening, I would say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead, Like if we're going to go ahead and do a case study evaluation, I want to look into language just based on this conversation that's had. So again, it's just meant to streamline and structure things. It's not meant to diagnose, but it's just meant to help guide your screening process, because what that can do is it can help make it more efficient when you're having those conversations, so that you know, all right, what information do I need that's going to indicate some red flags? And what you'll find is that when you're able to ask the right questions, you get used to that, and you can just use that information that you have to make a good decision, whether it be just like, you know, going forward with that evaluation, even though you haven't done a formal screening, or whether it be you did a formal screening and you want some more information. Again, remember that a screening isn't just one test. It's kind of this flexible process where you're just investigating, are there red flags here? So there's not necessarily one way to do it, but we want to be flexible with our thinking of what a screening is, because to be honest with you, there's never going to be one checklist or screener that's going to perfectly identify language skills. Language is so complex, and there's no way that we can accurately look at the entire picture in a 10-minute screening. But when it comes to practicality, that's what we have when it comes to doing a screening. So the more that you can have good conversations with teachers, in addition to any type of screening assessments or screening procedures that you're doing with the kids, the more you're going to be able to accurately identify kids who really do need evaluations in a way that's efficient. And again, this screener is not meant to be something that is a rigid, they have to have this number of, you know, they have to have this number on this tool, and, you know, so many, there's not anything formal or rigid about it. It's just meant for you to guide those discussions and get the information that you need. Because I know that when people say, all right, talk to the teacher, get some formal assessments, it can be kind of hard if you have no structure. So it's just meant to structure you a little bit, but still be flexible, because again, language is complex and we can't really just narrow it down and fine tune it. And I know that the way that we are often trained as SLPs is that we need to have this objective, definitive way of doing things, or we might even be getting pressure from our administrators to follow certain guidelines and have certain scores. That's not always how language works. It's a lot more flexible and fluid than that. So that's why we want to use tools like this that I'm going to share with you flexibly, and use them to help guide our process, but not be the process, if that makes sense. So again, screeners, tests, they're great tools. They're part of the process, but remember, a screening is a process. It's not one tool. And you can actually legally, if you are in the US, according to federal guidelines, you can initiate that screening without having some specific criterion score, if you have enough information available to you to say, hey, we're concerned here and we need to look further into it. Because again, screening is just to identify concerns. It's not meant to diagnose yet. So I'm going to share with you below this video in the comments. If you're watching this on my blog, it'll be below the video. I am going to share my academic language rating scale with you that I use to guide those conversations with teachers, to get information about when I should evaluate a student. And then also I use this to help me make progress updates for kids who are already on the caseload. So again, it's just meant to get information and guide those conversations and objectify that information a little bit, while at the same time being flexible. So I will share this academic language rating scale that you can use to help guide your screening process in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.